They vanished in silence, 6 children, ages 7 to 12, gone without a trace from an open apple field in the golden light of September 1982. No screams, no dragging footprints, just a trail of half-filled lunchboxes, a toppled tricycle, and a still-warm thermos leaking apple juice into the soil. It was as if the earth swallowed them whole. It started around 2:17 p.m., when the children were last seen by an elderly neighbor named Elma Carter, who was picking ripe Macintosh apples near her fence. She remembered waving at them. A few minutes later, she turned back, and they were gone, all of them, like the orchard had blinked them out of existence. The children, Tommy, Rachel, Devin, Leah, Sammy, and little June, had been playing just yards away from one another. Their parents were inside the farmhouse, preparing for a small harvest picnic. It was supposed to be an afternoon of laughter and family. Instead, it birthed a tragedy that would haunt an entire generation. Police arrived within the hour. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters scoured the surrounding farmland. The apple trees were combed trunk by trunk, their dense canopies split by shafts of sun and searchlights. But there were no signs of struggle, no signs of escape. Only the strange, synchronized vanishing of 6 innocent souls. Media swarmed the town the next day. Headlines screamed, "Apple Field abduction?" and vanished without a sound. Rumors of cults, UFOs, and human traffickers ran wild. But nothing could fill the aching vacuum of fact. Parents held on to hope, clutching school photos and handmade drawings. For weeks, the town stood still, suspended in disbelief. And then silence. No ransom notes. No sightings. No leads. Just an orchard that refused to give up its secrets. Apple Creek had always been the kind of place where time didn't just move slowly, it strolled. Nestled between gentle hills and rows of orchards, the town was no more than a dot on the state map. Known for its annual cider festival, its single-lane roads, and its unshakable quiet. People left their doors unlocked. Kids played freely in open fields, and nobody ever suspected that beneath the surface of their small-town bliss, a nightmare could take root. After the children disappeared, that stillness turned sinister. The morning after the vanishing, a heavy fog blanketed Apple Creek. The kind of fog that clings to the windows and seeps into your clothes. Church bells rang for longer than usual, and businesses didn't open. Not because the police ordered them to close, but because nobody had the will to go on with normal life. Something had ruptured, something invisible, yet too loud to ignore. The school canceled classes indefinitely. Teachers tried to send homework to homes, but nobody could bring themselves to sit their children down and pretend anything was okay. Parents suddenly clung to their kids, even the teenagers. Outdoor play became taboo. Fields, once places of laughter, turned into forbidden zones. Sheriff Gerald Marks, a no-nonsense man with 23 years in service, held daily briefings in front of the town hall. He repeated the same grim lines. "We are doing everything we can, and no lead will be left uninvestigated." But with each day, his face sagged further. His voice lost its edge. He was grasping at air. Local radio stations changed their programming. The upbeat midday segments were replaced by somber instrumental music. DJs offered thoughts and prayers before each hour. Stores sold out of flashlights, locks, and fences. A few families quietly packed and left town, unable to look at the orchard or face the ache in the eyes of neighbors. And then there were the rumors. They sprouted like weeds. Some said the land was cursed. Others whispered about an old man who lived near the west fence of the field. The Watcher, they called him. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the woods at night, but most didn't make it past the gates. One girl claimed she saw a shape between the trees. Not human, not animal. The town dismissed her, but her voice cracked when she swore it. More disturbing were the anonymous letters slipped under the church door. Sloppy handwriting, No return address. The first one simply read, "It wasn't the first time." Another, weeks later, said, "You buried the truth once. It's rising." Pastor Leonard tried to preach hope, but the pews grew emptier each Sunday. People didn't stop believing in God. They just couldn't understand why he'd let 6 children be stolen from his earth. Families of the missing kids became shadows. Tommy's father, Bill, stopped shaving. His knuckles bled from punching the barn walls at night. Rachel's mother, Elise, started lighting 6 candles every dusk and didn't speak for days. June's older brother, Kevin, quit school entirely. He just turned 16. Every morning, he walked the orchard, calling her name like a prayer stuck on repeat. The town psychiatrist, Dr. Mallory, opened her clinic for free. She said she saw 48 patients in 1 week. Mostly children having nightmares, parents hallucinating footsteps outside their doors, and elderly residents plagued with guilt. Nobody knew why they felt guilty. Maybe just for living. Weeks turned to months. Autumn leaves covered the field like a burial shroud. Snow followed. The empty branches of the apple trees looked like outstretched hands, pleading with the sky. No new evidence. No new hope. Then the town did something unusual. It stopped speaking. Not just about the event, but altogether. Neighbors waved but didn't chat. Families sat around dinner tables in silence. Children learned to whisper. Fear became etiquette. And eventually, people learned to live alongside it. 1 year after the vanishings, the orchard grew again. Apples came in heavier that season, oddly so. No one picked them. They rotted on the ground. She had lived in the same faded blue cottage for 52 years, nestled just 2 fields over from the infamous apple grove. Her name was Martha Liddell, retired librarian, part-time beekeeper, and a woman most people in Apple Creek had long forgotten. She was the kind who kept to herself, preferred books over gossip, and talked to her dog more than to people. But in November of 1983, nearly 14 months after the children vanished, Martha tried to speak. No one listened. Back then, she had come forward hesitantly, stopping Sheriff Marks outside the pharmacy. "I think I saw something," she said, her voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves. The sheriff, hollow-eyed and half a year into dead-end leads, glanced at her with polite exhaustion. She told him she had seen lights in the orchard that afternoon. Not flashlight beams, blue flashes, rhythmic and pulsing. She said they didn't look man-made. Sheriff Marks scribbled something on his notepad, nodded, and said he'd follow up. He didn't. Martha, discouraged, retreated into solitude. But the memory didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. She remembered hearing a deep hum in the air, something almost mechanical but melodic, like a giant tuning fork buried underground. Her dog, Pickles, had barked for hours that evening and refused to walk past the orchard for months. Years passed. Apple Creek tried to forget, but Martha didn't. In 1995, she wrote a letter to the local newspaper. The editorial team, desperate for something other than harvest updates, published it in a back column. It read, "I believe what I saw that day was real. I believe it mattered. I know I'm not young or flashy or loud, but sometimes the quiet ones witness the loudest truths." The piece was ignored, not out of malice, but fatigue. The town had bled too long and grown too tired. By 2002, Martha was an old woman with cataracts, a garden of wild thyme, and a drawer filled with rejected letters to law enforcement. Still, she watched the orchard. Every evening at sunset, she sat on her porch with binoculars, scanning the treetops, whispering prayers. She said she was waiting for the orchard to blink again. Then, in January 2024, just days before her 89th birthday, Martha made a final call to the regional FBI office in Crescent County. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "I think you're going to want to dig where the apples don't grow." The agent on the line, Special Investigator Claire Morel, almost dismissed the call as senile rambling. But something in the woman's tone was unnerving. Certain, detailed, out of professional courtesy, or perhaps curiosity. Claire visited the property. She expected to spend 10 minutes, drink a cup of lukewarm tea, and excuse herself politely. Instead, she stayed for 4 hours. Martha handed her a hand-drawn map. Not crude, not fanciful, precise. It marked a patch of orchard that never bore fruit, even in peak season. She claimed the trees whispered there. Claire didn't believe her, but she took the map. 2 weeks later, the FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar. The equipment lit up twice. Beneath the dry soil were 2 sealed chambers. Not graves, structures, buried deliberately, with metallic lining and strange insulation properties. They were far too advanced for anything rural Apple Creek should have seen in the early 1980s. Martha didn't live to see what came next. She died in her sleep 3 days after handing over the map. Smiling, they said. But her voice, ignored for decades, had finally cracked the silence. The orchard had always been quiet, but the morning the FBI returned with excavation gear, it felt like the trees were holding their breath. Agent Claire Morel stood at the edge of the barren patch Martha had pointed out, where no apples had grown for decades. The air smelled off here. Metallic, too still for February. A forensic team set up perimeter lights while specialists calibrated the ground-penetrating radar. As the first layer of soil was removed, shovels hit something not quite stone, not quite metal. A dull thunk echoed, low and unsettling. It was a hatch, circular, brushed steel, with no visible handle. Its surface was covered in fine lines. Etched symbols like slashes and curves, almost like writing, but no language the agents could recognize. Radiation levels were normal. Magnetic fields weren't. The compass needles shook in place. They cracked it open using a controlled hydraulic lift. The hatch groaned as if it hadn't been opened in 40 years, which it hadn't. Below it, a cylindrical tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, lined with synthetic material that didn't match any commercial polymer from the early 80s. Claire descended first. The tunnel dropped 12 feet before opening into a chamber. Her flashlight beam revealed walls that curved in perfect arcs. The interior was padded with thick insulation, gray, but reflective like glass fiber. There was no dirt, no roots. Everything had been sealed airtight. Then she saw them. Drawings, childlike, etched into the walls with some sharp object. 6 names, 6 different handwriting styles. Each one marked a section of the chamber. Tommy, Rachel. June, Eric, Leo, Nina. Symbols surrounded the names. Houses, trees, stick figures, suns, and eyes. Lots of eyes. And then the most chilling inscription. They told us not to scream. But we forgot. Dated October 7th, 1982. Claire's blood ran cold. No bodies, no bones, no remains. Just an old wooden box in the center of the chamber. Inside, 6 cloth dolls. Each was labeled with a child's name. Each had a sewn-on mouth, stitched shut. One of the dolls had been torn open, its mouth stitches loose. DNA testing on the fabric later confirmed they had traces of all 6 missing children. But the chamber wasn't the only one. A second structure was found 40 feet west. Nearly identical. Same materials, same design. But this one was completely empty. Not a single drawing, no dolls, no names. Just silence. Some believed it was meant for more children. Others whispered it had already been used. The strange part? No technology from 1982 could have built these chambers without leaving a trace. No tire marks, no noise, no footprints, no permits. The orchard's soil showed no signs of disturbance until now. Even stranger, The interior temperature of the chambers remained a stable 68 degrees Fahrenheit, despite winter conditions outside. There was no power source. When news broke, Apple Creek didn't react with outrage. It reacted with horror and silence, as if they already suspected this place was never right. The church bells didn't ring. Families stayed inside. Candles lined the windows of homes once again, just like the first year after the vanishings. This time, though, the candles weren't for hope. They were for protection. Some townspeople claimed their radios picked up static-filled whispers when tuned to 98.2 FM, a frequency no station used. A few said the trees at the edge of the orchard leaned differently that week, as if turning to look. Claire and her team filed the chambers under unidentified subterranean anomalies. The official report labeled them as makeshift fallout shelters. But no one believed that, because something had prepared those rooms. Something that had waited. Something that wasn't finished. After the discovery of the underground chambers, something changed in Apple Creek. It wasn't just fear. It was memory, or the sudden unraveling of it. Locals began coming forward with stories they had never told. Not because they didn't want to, but because they claimed they hadn't remembered. Not until now. Eleanor Briggs, now in her 70s, was the school secretary in 1982. She walked into the police station one foggy morning, gripping a leather-bound attendance book that had gathered dust in her attic. She placed it on the front desk and whispered. They were erased. Inside, next to the names of the 6 missing children, were perfectly clean spaces, blank lines. Not crossed out, not smudged, just gone, as if no one had ever written them to begin with. Eleanor swore she remembered writing their names every day for roll call. But when she looked back months after they vanished, the names weren't there. She thought she had imagined them. She wasn't alone. Bill Yates, the town's only barber since 1970, said one of the boys, Tommy, used to come in every other Tuesday for a trim. Kid liked his part on the left. Wore this weird red cap, Bill recalled. But when asked why he'd never mentioned it, Bill paused. I dunno. I didn't remember him till 2 nights ago. Dreamt of that cap sitting on my windowsill. Similar accounts trickled in. A town clerk found an old flyer advertising a 1982 Apple Festival, something no one could remember attending. A retired pastor recalled officiating a funeral service for someone small, but the church registry had no such record. An elderly farmer swore he once found 6 pairs of tiny shoes by the orchard fence, but forgot about them the next day. It was as if the town had collectively forgotten key parts of its history. But why? Dr. Mariana Reeve, a cognitive psychologist from Chicago, was brought in by the FBI to investigate mass memory distortion. She initially suspected shared trauma response, a well-documented phenomenon where groups suppress painful events to cope. But Apple Creek was different. She found evidence of involuntary amnesia among dozens of townspeople. Gaps in memory, missing years, inconsistent handwriting in diaries, even calendar entries scratched out and rewritten days later. One family's entire photo album from 1982 was blank. Not torn, not removed, just blank pages. Even the local newspaper archives were affected. Pages from 1982 were damaged in strange ways. The ink hadn't faded, it had vanished. Entire paragraphs looked as though they'd been typed with invisible ribbon. Dr. Reeve ran a neurological study on 10 residents. 6 showed signs of hippocampal disturbance, anomalies usually linked to exposure to high-frequency sound waves or prolonged sensory deprivation. But Apple Creek had no documented use of such technology. Then came the photographs. One was discovered by a young college student named Caleb, who'd returned to visit his grandfather. In the basement, buried in an old trunk, he found a Polaroid labeled Apple Festival, 1982. In it were smiling families, picnic tables, and a row of children in front of a stage. In the center stood 6 kids holding paper apple lanterns. Their faces were blurred, not from motion or damage, blurred at the moment of capture, like heat waves had bent their features. FBI tech analysts used AI image reconstruction. Facial outlines began to form. One by one, they matched the blurred children with the missing kids' school portraits. There was no doubt now. They were present at the festival. That changed everything. If the town had held a celebration after the disappearances, it would be chilling enough. But this proved something more terrifying. The children hadn't vanished immediately. They were still in town, alive, visible, participating in events weeks, maybe months, after they were first reported missing. But no one remembered them being there. Not even their families. Worse, there was one adult standing directly behind the children in the photo. A man, tall, wearing a gray suit, face fully visible. No one in town recognized him. Facial recognition databases came up empty. Claire Morel called him the overseer, because that's how he looked, like someone observing a harvest. More photos emerged. Always the same man, always near the children, always looking directly into the lens, but never interacting, never aging. Local folklore experts unearthed a decades-old tale called The Man of Orchard Hill, a regional myth predating the founding of Apple Creek. The legend spoke of a man who appeared every third generation, marked by a failed harvest and a childless winter. He was known to whisper promises to those who wandered the fields alone. Claire asked the town historian why no one had ever mentioned the tale. The historian paused and replied, "Because we're not supposed to remember him. We never do." By now, the case had shifted from a cold file to something far more cryptic, something no federal protocol or psychological theory could fully explain. But the final spark that ignited the full truth came from a place no one expected: a sealed wooden box buried beneath the orchard's oldest tree. During the excavation near the underground chambers, one of the backhoes struck something solid, oak, preserved unnaturally well. Inside was a collection of papers, tightly bound by twine, coated in wax. The documents were dated 1905, 1928, and 1957, each about 23 years apart. Each year matched a recorded instance of missing children in nearby counties, cases never connected, until now. But it wasn't just the dates that shocked the investigators. It was what the documents contained. They weren't police reports. They weren't farm records. They were contracts, agreements, signed with names, some real, some marked only with an X. They were crude, handwritten, and ominously poetic. One read, "In exchange for prosperity and protection of land, we give what cannot be replaced, in numbers divisible by 3, and faces that will not be remembered." These documents outlined what came to be known as the Harvest Pact, a folkloric covenant stretching back at least a century. According to the entries, every few decades, selected families would offer their children to the overseer, in return for an abundant harvest, protection from disease, and silence from war. It was madness, until investigators realized how consistent the agricultural records were. Apple Creek's orchard yields were abnormally high every 23 years. The town, isolated and rural, had somehow thrived while surrounding counties faced crop blight, economic depression, even tornadoes. The FBI turned to historical weather maps and regional census data. Sure enough, there were unexplained gaps in population growth during those same decades. But why didn't anyone remember? Further notes in the documents hinted at a clause. The memory of sacrifice shall be lifted from the eyes of the giver. For peace to remain, remembrance must perish. It was memory erasure, a condition of the pact itself. The overseer wasn't just a myth or a manifestation of trauma. He was a ritual figure, embedded in the town's history like a cursed ancestor. neither spirit nor man, but a custodian of equilibrium between human greed and supernatural order. What terrified investigators most was that the signatures on the most recent contract from 1957 included names of still-living residents, mayors, elders, church deacons. When confronted, none of them recalled ever signing such a thing. But then something even more disturbing happened. Rachel's mother, yes, Rachel, one of the vanished six, was visited by an FBI liaison after the documents were recovered. She was asked about a peculiar line in her medical records. Reported missing child, recovered but unresponsive, record sealed. She had no memory of such an entry. But under deep hypnosis administered by Dr. Mariana Reeve, a horrifying image surfaced. Rachel lying in a crib. Alive, eyes open, but blank, emotionless. No crying, no blinking, just a still, almost mannequin-like child being lifted from a wicker basket outside the farmhouse. Behind the child stood a tall figure in gray. Reeve stopped the session immediately. The imagery was too similar across all six families. Each parent, under hypnosis, recalled some moment, long buried, when they found or lost their child in a surreal, dreamlike state, often followed by days of confusion or memory fog. The children weren't abducted in the conventional sense. They were taken and returned multiple times before the final vanishing. The orchard, the town, and the overseer seemed to operate in a temporal loop, observing, testing, selecting. Claire, obsessed and unable to sleep, took to digging into church records. That's when she found it. An old sermon written by her grandfather in 1957, titled On the Fruits We Do Not Sow. It spoke in parables about bargaining with hunger and feeding the earth with laughter that fades. More chillingly, it included an apology. Forgive us, for the yield we sow is not ours to keep. What is given must be taken, lest all rot. By this point, Agent Dunley had heard enough. He authorized a full-scale closure of the orchard. Armed guards were placed around the perimeter. Soil samples were taken, and a plan was made to perform a final ground-penetrating radar scan beneath the oldest trees, hoping to find remains or structural anomalies. But something went wrong. On the night before the scan, all equipment inside the orchard stopped working. Cameras blanked out. Radios died. Flashlights flickered violently. Guards reported hearing voices, whispers in a language that didn't sound human. One even claimed to see children walking between the trees, just out of reach, always in shadows, always barefoot. The next morning, 3 of the guards resigned. They wouldn't speak about what they saw. Only one left a note. The roots remember. We shouldn't. Claire knew then that this wasn't about finding bodies or solving a cold case anymore. It was about breaking a cycle. But the final question hung heavy in the air. If the pact was broken, what would the overseer take next? The final radar scan was scheduled for 6 a.m. The plan was simple. Map the subsoil and identify irregularities. Claire stood with Dunley and a team of specialists, watching the monitors flicker to life. For a moment, everything was quiet, too quiet. And then, the screen began to fill. Dozens of voids, cavities, pockets, hollow spaces. Not just 1 or 2, at least 18, some as shallow as 3 feet, others buried deep. Beneath them, old wooden structures like tunnels or chambers, mapped with precision as if someone, or something, had built them long ago. The shapes were not random. They were in perfect alignment with the orchard's planting grid, symmetrical, controlled. But what stopped everyone's breath were the 6 newest voids. Fresh, recently disturbed, each precisely beneath where the 6 children were last seen. Dunley, Claire, and the team rushed to the closest point. Shovels hit dirt. With every layer pulled away, the air grew colder. Unnaturally so, as if the earth itself were resisting intrusion. At exactly 4 feet down, they hit wood. Not a coffin, but a box. Plain, clean, almost new. They pried it open. Inside was a single item. A child's red mitten, perfectly preserved, untouched by time. Stitched on the cuff in yellow thread. Sammy. Claire dropped to her knees. Her hand trembled as she reached in. But the moment her fingers touched the mitten, the wind picked up. A deafening screech, like trees crying, rippled through the orchard. Leaves flew upward in spirals. Cameras failed again. Everyone stumbled back. And in the distance, from within the trees, came laughter. Children's laughter. Thin, hollow, echoing. Suddenly, from the other excavation sites, voices called out. More boxes. More objects. A ribbon. A drawing. A toy soldier. Each linked to one of the missing children. But no bones. No flesh. Just tokens. Like offerings. They were never meant to be found, Dunley whispered. Just remembered. Differently. That night, Claire returned to her family home for the first time in 20 years. The house was dusty, the windows boarded, but inside was something she'd never noticed as a child. Beneath the floorboards in the attic, a crawl space sealed with wax and nails. She opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters, her own handwriting, age 11. They spoke of dreams she didn't remember, voices in the orchard, playing with children she couldn't name. One note ended with, "If we leave, he'll come, but if we stay, he'll sleep." Claire broke down. The children hadn't vanished. They'd been exchanged, held in some space between, perhaps alive in a different form, perhaps echoes of memory made physical. The pact wasn't a one-time event. It was an inheritance. But who started it? The last letter in the bundle was older, signed in faded ink by someone named A. Fenwick, dated 1882. It read, "Let the orchard grow. Let the children forget. But mark the roots well. They bind more than trees." The name Fenwick matched the family that founded Apple Creek. And the orchard? It was planted exactly 1 year after a massive wildfire destroyed the original town. Claire finally understood. Apple Creek wasn't a town blessed by the land. It was built on the price of forgetting. A carefully tended amnesia passed from one generation to the next. And now, with the pact broken, the overseer awake, and the children's artifacts disturbed, one question remained. Would he reclaim what it began with a flicker? The streetlights along Hollow Grove Road blinked twice, then shut off entirely. Cell towers failed. Radios turned to static. Clocks froze at 3:17 a.m. All across Apple Creek, people woke up in cold sweats, their windows rattling without wind, their children whispering in their sleep. Something had crossed back. Claire received the alert at 3:23 a.m. A local farmer, Earl Whitcomb, had reported children standing in his orchard. Not walking, just standing, silent. 6 of them, pale, not moving. By the time the agents arrived, the figures were gone, but in their place were 6 small piles of apple blossoms. Blooming, out of season, the trees around them were withered, as if drained to feed the sudden burst of life in those tiny mounds. And then the calls started coming in. A family near the old train depot said their daughter had vanished from her bed, only to be found hours later in the attic, standing still, eyes open, unblinking, clutching a red ribbon. A local deputy saw 3 children walking hand in hand down Main Street, barefoot in the cold. When he approached, they vanished into thin air. Claire knew this wasn't apparition. It was return. The children were not spirits. They were never dead. But they were not entirely human anymore either. They had been changed, marked by the place they had been trapped in. And now that place was bleeding back into reality. At dawn, Claire went back to the orchard alone. The trees were humming. Not wind, not leaves. A low vibration, almost like breathing. In the exact center of the orchard, Where the radar had found nothing, the ground had cracked open. Not from shovels or machines. Spontaneously. A fissure, wide and spiraling, as if the earth had been twisted and split like an orange peel. She looked down and saw steps, carved in stone, descending in a perfect spiral. Claire descended. It was neither day nor night inside, just dim, unnatural twilight. The stone grew darker as she went deeper, now warm to the touch. The air smelled like burnt cedar and electricity. And then silence, complete silence. Her breath no longer echoed. She reached the chamber. At the center stood a stone altar. Upon it, 6 dolls, the same as before. But now they had eyes. Real human eyes. Open. Watching. The sewn mouths had unraveled. Each one whispered, faintly. "We told you not to scream." The ground pulsed. And from the walls, roots emerged. Not of trees. Something older. Thicker. Pulsing like veins. They reached toward her, not threatening, but beckoning. They wanted her to understand. Visions flooded her mind. The original pact. In 1882, during the Great Fire, the people of Apple Creek were desperate. A stranger arrived, a man with no name, pale as ash, wearing a coat stitched from animal hide and old maps. He promised survival, shelter, but he demanded a price. 6 children, every 40 years, given willingly or taken silently. They agreed. The orchard was planted as a gate. Every generation forgot. Except Claire's generation. The bond had been broken because of something she had done. The dreams, the letters, the hiding place in her attic. She had remembered when she should have forgotten. She had broken the loop. Suddenly, the whispers turned to voices. Clear, loud, childlike. You remembered. You brought them. The altar cracked. The dolls crumbled to dust. And from the floor rose 6 figures. Children, but not the same. They glowed with pale light, their eyes unnatural and deep. They spoke in unison. You are the last who must choose. One must stay, so the rest may go. Claire stepped back. What did they mean? Then she saw a 7th doll, half-formed, its mouth still stitched shut. Her name, Claire, sewn across its chest. The price was never just the lost. It was also the witness. The one who sees must seal. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "Take me." The chamber brightened. The wall sighed. The orchard above went still. And the children vanished. By sunrise, the town of Apple Creek stirred into a different kind of silence. Not one of confusion or panic, but of awe. The fog clung to the ground like a heavy secret, and the orchard, once a scene of grief and obsession, now stood eerily still. Not lifeless, just emptied, as if it had released something it had held for far too long. 6 children were found by daybreak, alive, sleeping gently in their childhood beds, as if no time had passed. But their bodies had changed. Rachel now bore a white streak in her hair. Devin's hands trembled slightly. Little June had forgotten how to speak, but clutched her sketchbook with pages filled in a strange, spiraling script. Doctors ran tests. Everything was inconclusive. No signs of trauma, no drugs, no cellular damage. Only that their eyes had aged, like they'd seen lifetimes. The families wept, held them, didn't let go. But Claire wasn't found. Her house was unlocked, keys on the table. A single note sat on her nightstand, unsigned, in her handwriting. If it cost me my life to bring them home, I would still call it a fair trade. Authorities searched the orchard. Again, the spiraled fissure had vanished. Only a ring of blackened grass remained, seared into the earth like a permanent scar. Some said it looked like a seal. Others said it was the last breath of something ancient, finally buried. The town buried her as a hero, but no body was found. No grave held her name. Only a stone placed at the base of the oldest apple tree, carved simply. She remembered what we all forgot. The children eventually grew up. They never spoke of what happened beneath the orchard. Not publicly, but once a year, always on September 14th, they would return to that tree, sit in a circle, say nothing, just place 6 apples and 1 old doll at the base, and leave. Whispers of what happened turned to legend. Apple Creek became a place of pilgrimage for those chasing lost answers. Paranormal investigators, journalists, desperate parents. But no one ever found another gate. The orchard gave no more. It had fulfilled its pact and asked for silence in return. Years later, in 2062, when little June was in her 60s, she spoke a single sentence to her granddaughter as they passed the tree. Some roots run deeper than memory, but love reaches further still. And that was the end of it. No more vanishings, no more signs, just an orchard and the stories it held. But locals still claim, if you walk beneath the trees at night, especially near the oldest one, and listen carefully, you might hear the faintest